Australians have a way of shortening words, and they're known for it really. And so can you just kind of explain to us how they shorten things, like what they would shorten them to?
Well, a classic example would be our greeting Gday, and this is obviously shortened from good day, which if you say it in its full, it's something like a formal greeting, good day. You know, it sounds quite formal actually, but in Australia what we do is we reduce those two words into really just one, so the good becomes g and the day stays there and we say g'day. And when you add that bit of pronunciation with the Australian sort of vowel, it has a very particular characteristic, and it's become really a symbol of the Australian in English form, and you'll see it on flags and posters and tourist campaigns everywhere in Australia.
Okay, so Nick, can you give us kind of a brief history of how the language has evolved as it has in Sydney?
Well, Sydney's the place where the colony began, so English has been spoken here away from the UK for a very long time, more than a couple of hundred years. And so, because it's isolated from the rest of the English-speaking world, certainly in the early period, it was able to develop in its own way. So the view, that people normally take is that because Australia was isolated and it was populated at that time, in terms of the English-speaking world, by people from all walks of life, including, the underbelly of society, that a value of very informal sort of language became, important in Australia. So what people notice when they come here is that English is a bit different from the rest of the world, and it's characterised by a quite informal style. So Australian English has very many aspects to it. There are various words that we use that aren't used elsewhere, various expressions. But one of the things that people notice is the way that we abbreviate words, and we change words in special ways. So one group of words ends in the sound O. So we'll take words like relative or renovation or afternoon, just normal words, and just take the first part of the word, cut the rest of the word off, throw it away, and add O at the end. So relative becomes relo, afternoon becomes arvo, renovation becomes reno. So there are many, many words that are like that, and you will encounter them if you come to Australia pretty quickly. Avocado becomes avo, and that's not to be confused with arvo. So arvo is for afternoon, avo for avocado. A classic Australian activity is the outdoor barbecue, and when people refer to that, they often call that a barbie. And using the same formula, take the barb part, throw away the rest of the word, add the E on the end, and you get barbie. Another group of words very similar to that. You cut everything off the word except the first part, but with these words you add E. So you have, for example, a freshwater crocodile is a freshie, and a saltwater crocodile is a salty. But there are many other words, like breakfast becomes brekkie. There's even a word coldy, which refers to a cold can of beer. So a cold one becomes cut off and it becomes a coldy. You have many others for example, chocolate becomes chocky, or mosquito becomes mozzie. And then one last group of words, which is a little bit more specialised, is where you take, for example, the name of the city of Sydney, and you cut off the last part of the word and you add the sound uz. So Sydney becomes sidders. Or even Hong Kong becomes honkers. We have also funny kinds of expressions. So the word for full in Australian English is chock-a-block, and that becomes chockers. So we might say the bus is chockers to mean that it's completely full. So one more characteristic of Australian English is how we refer to people's names. So we often shorten them in similar ways to what I've described for other kinds of words. But there's a special group of names where there's an R at the end of the first syllable. So you might have a name like Harry, or Barry, or Sharon. And what we do is cut off everything but the first part of the word, and then we change the R into a Z and add an A. So it's quite a sort of complicated little formula, but Sharon becomes Shazza, Barry becomes Bazza, Harold becomes Hazza. And we even do this with non-English names. For example, a Japanese woman I knew was named Hiroko, and she became Hiza.
That's good. It's good. So when they take the first syllable, it's like the first syllable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when they take the first syllable and say they call you like they add that z at the end.
Yeah, like
what does that mean?
Bazza.
What does it mean? I mean, is it are they being friendly, or are they being?
Well, if your name's Sharon and I call you Shazza, that is somewhat friendly. It's also a way of indicating that I'm treating you in a very sort of informal way, and it's also considered to be a little bit funny and a little bit of a jokey kind of name, although it's used every day. And it's characteristically Australian. So if you said Shazza,
but it's friendly. It's a good thing. It's not nobody's doing it out of. It's a nice thing to be called.
That's right. Yeah, it wouldn't be rude, but because it's very informal, it wouldn't really be appropriate for a formal speech or some sort of speech in Parliament or something like that. But it's definitely a sign of the very informal kind of nature of society, and quite friendly at most of the time in Australia.
So Australians use the word mate a lot. Where is it appropriate to use that?
The word mate is one of the famous kind of words of Australian English, and traditionally it's been a word that's appropriate to use between men in an informal setting. So, we might say, "How are you going, mate?" would be a way of saying hello, or "G'day, mate" would be kind of classic greeting. But you would use it, for example, in asking somebody a question who you've never met, even though it seems like a very friendly sort of word. You might say, "Excuse me, mate, can you tell me what time it is?" So mate is common in everyday interaction, but it's really changing quite a lot in recent years. So I said that it was really a word that men would normally use. Now you would hear women using it a lot more. And people using it when they're addressing women. What we also see in Australia is that's beginning to change too. So people are using mate, I think, a little bit less often than they used to, and now beginning to use words like pal and buddy and words that have similar meaning but that are understood outside of the Australian English-speaking world.
And so if somebody comes up to you and they're saying, "How are you going?"
Yeah.
Why do they say that rather than "How are you"? Why do they say "How are you going"?
How are you going? Well, greetings and other kinds of everyday phrases that we use vary a lot all around the world, and they often give some sort of unique flavour of the place where you are. So, you'll find anywhere you go, whether you're in Ireland or the US or Canada, people will have slightly different sort of greetings for people. And so I think that we can't really read too much into the literal meaning of that expression, "How are you going?" as opposed to "How are you?" It's just something that's stuck in the kind of Australian habit, if you like, of language. And so when we say, "How are you going, mate?" that is a real sign that we are in Australia, and that's where we come from. And particularly when we use the Australian accent and really sort of drawl over that expression, saying, "How you going, mate?" would be the classic kind of pronunciation of that.
When somebody says "Gday," what's the difference between that and "How you going"?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, "How you going?" and "G'day." To be honest, I have no idea what the difference is. So that would be like, there are so many ways of greeting a person, and some of them, of course, are specific to what time of day it is. So Good morning, good evening, that sort of thing. "G'day," and "How you going?" Well, what would you say? What's the difference between hello and how are you? You could say "Hello, John," or you can say "How are you, John?" Either of them, would fit in terms of a greeting. So it's not clear to me. But "How you going?" and "G'day." One difference would be that "G'day" is a trademark Australian expression, whereas "How you going?" is possible anywhere in the world.
And people don't always wait for a response really when they're saying, how you going? It's not necessarily looking for a response, is it? It's this kind of higher, you know, and almost acknowledging the other person rather than, would you say?
That's correct, yeah. That's the nature of greetings in general, that unlike real contributions to a conversation, a greeting is just a way to get things rolling. So when we say, how are you, or how are you going, we're not necessarily interested in getting the full story of what's the situation in your life right now. It's a way of starting off the conversation.